Maureen O'Hara, a name that once prompted Hollywood to alter its lights the moment she strolled into the frame. She became the most sought-after face of the Technicolor era, with blazing red hair, steely blue eyes, and a unique beauty that seemed to absorb color. The strong woman was portrayed on screen by Maureen O'Hara, who stood side to shoulder with the most powerful men in vintage Hollywood. She did not exist at the boundary of the story. By sheer power of an unfading presence, she stood in its core. But only because of the lights was that surface visible to the outside world. Beyond those shimmering frames was another reality. A woman who was brought up in strict discipline, entering Hollywood amid towering egos and discovering early that beauty was never a shield sturdy enough. Maureen O'Hara chose toughness as a means of endurance and suffered for it by being frequently left out of the spotlight in a field that is used to rewarding female surrender. Maureen O'Hara was not born to be a muse. Her sense of self-worth was like a survival instinct. She has learned to stay upright along precarious boundaries throughout her life, such as those between love and violence, passion and control, and fame and personal safety. She did not exchange sorrow for continued attention, nor did she turn suffering into myth. Instead, she chose to remain silent, leave, and repeatedly start over in order to shield the part of herself that Hollywood was never able to witness. The world still recalls Maureen O'Hara as the Technicolor queen and the most incandescent woman of her day more than 50 years later. However, there was a real person behind that title. One who Mother Third alone endured in silence, loved sincerely, and frequently took the decision to leave glory when the price of staying was too severe. The issue still stands, though, was a woman who had dedicated her whole life to learning how to defend herself in the dark, ever warmed by the brilliant light of fame. Maureen O'Hara was born on August 17, 1920, in Raya, a southern suburb of Dublin. She was the second of Charles Fitzsimons and Marguerite Fitzsimons's 6 children. The family was not wealthy, but they also weren't living in luxury. Life functions on order rather than exhibition, with daily rituals driven by restraint and discipline. After running a sporting goods company, Charles Fitzsimons got involved in football administration and had connections to Shamrock Rovers. He considered athletics to be a training program in which endurance was more significant than celebrity. Marguerite Fitzsimons was trained in the classical style of operatic singing. Music was a constant presence in the household, but never as performance. Practice took place every day at predetermined intervals and was always associated with accuracy and repetition. From an early age, the 6 children were exposed to the arts. The majority of Maureen's siblings went on to work in entertainment or the arts. Margot Fitzsimons became a film actress. Before going into producing, Charles Fitzsimons was an actor. James Fitzsimons was involved in both film and theater. The only sister to fully give up the arts in favor of a convent life was Peggy, the eldest. Despite being working artists, the family had no notion what it meant to be well known. The stage was not the ultimate destination for Marguerite Fitzsimons's children. She gave discipline a lot of attention. drama, dance, and vocal training were all included in a basic education that was on par with academic studies. Art was a means to govern the body, the voice, and time itself, not a way to attract attention. In that environment, skill was not appreciated early, and selecting the arts was never considered a privilege. Because the Fitzsimons home encouraged creativity without indulgence, that rhythm became the first pillar that Maureen O'Hara carried with her throughout her life. Maureen started taking dance and theatrical classes when he was 6 years old. Neither exploratory nor expressive training was used. It was repetitious, systematic, and focused on muscle control, rhythm, and memory. She only needed to finish the assignments, do them correctly, and then do them again until they were satisfactory. Maureen began taking part in local theatrical plays at the age of 14. This was not a moment of introduction or discovery. The stage was only the next phase of her training, subject to the same rules. Errors were neither excused nor eased for any reason. Thus, there was no excitement to standing in front of an audience. It mirrored going into a timed shift with clearly stated expectations. That work pattern became more severe, but remained familiar by the time she was employed by the Abbey Theatre. This environment did not allow for emotional outbursts or personal bias. Discipline, memory, and endurance were used to decide roles. Demands that Maureen had long since internalized. She believed that the stage was a place where one had to stay solid by exhibiting true capability rather than a place to impose oneself. Charles Fitzsimons encouraged his daughter to pursue a career in typing and bookkeeping in addition to the arts, not to take the place of the stage, but rather to avoid being dependent on it. He saw performance as a delicate, unstable profession that should never be the focus of a person's entire life. This lesson was never explained. It was merely a condition. Maureen's teenage years were clearly separated. Performances in the evening, school during the day. Self-reflection required less time than training. There was no room to think of oneself as unique. The rhythm developed into a habit. Work through to the end without waiting for validation. When she moved to London from Ireland in the late 1930s, she approached movie studios like a stage actress, trying out a new mood. Dry and cold, little roles, several screen tests, and a technical setting. There was no reaction, no denunciation, and no support from the camera. Movies didn't affect her emotionally at the time. It was merely a career opportunity, not yet a fate. A pivotal event occurred when Charles Elton became aware of her. It's not a camera-friendly beauty, rather, it's the steadiness of a physique refined by stage discipline, which is hard to measure by commercial standards. She signed a 7-year contract with Elton, putting Maureen firmly on the path to becoming a movie star. At the same time, the name Fitzsimons was swapped with O'Hara, a simple modification on paper, but one that signaled the first moment her personal identity was merged into the logic of the business. Filmmaking required more than just an actress. It needed a name that was positionable. In 1939, Jamaica Inn was released. Despite his minimal involvement, Maureen's working rhythm was very different from the stage's. It was necessary to suppress all expressions. Every feeling had to wait for the camera's angle. There was no way to outpace the audience. That same year, The Hunchback of Notre Dame drew her into a project of far greater scope and clear goal. Esmeralda Morin is caught between two competing forces: the dreadful weight of the plot and the Technicolor's beautiful magnificence. The film was a great hit and quickly solidified its position in the studio system, thanks to its substantial budget and multiple high-profile technical nominations. The effects occurred almost quickly after. Morin's contract was bought by RKO Radio Pictures, which put her among the faces that would be developed over time. From then on, she was an image being developed rather than a stage actress cautiously entering the film world. Hollywood's new Technicolor face. The lights grew brighter. Opportunities multiplied. However, at the same time, the emphasis began shifting from self-control to star strategy, from performance to image. There arose a subtle tension that was not yet explosive, but was sufficient to establish Maureen O'Hara's place in the system, visible, but always at a distance that was difficult to close. In 1941, How Green Was My Valley came at an era when Hollywood was beginning to move away from noisy spectacle toward more constrained structures of memory and family life. In the film, Maureen O'Hara played Ang Har, a character who isn't central to the plot, but is nonetheless noticeable. Her character progresses through the plot in finely timed pauses, closed eyes that result in admissions. Rather than being released, emotions were suppressed, personal desire yielding to communal necessity. There isn't a clear climax. What is left unsaid carries the weight. On set, John Ford maintained a hard-working cadence. Actors were not allowed to display emotion outside of the overall framework of the movie. Any excess was eliminated. This required a fundamental shift for O'Hara, who abandoned theatrical conventions that rely on large movement to engage an audience in order to operate within the frame's limitations. This function did not allow for intensity correction. It only took one mistake to invalidate a take. There was a swift and strong response to the film's worldwide dissemination. How Green Was My Valley outperformed a number of highly praised films that year and took home 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. There was no single nomination for Maureen O'Hara. However, due of her pivotal role in the storyline rather than her short screen time, Angar emerged as one of the most frequently mentioned female characters when discussing the film's emotional compression. The structure of movement and vision in Hollywood soon began to revolve on color. On set, Maureen O'Hara worked in situations that needed continuous physical involvement. She stood in the sun and wind for long periods of time, clambered, clung to ship decks that swayed violently, and kept time when mistakes were not an option. Before color and lighting finished the frame, the labor was defined. In those circumstances, the Black Swan was created. Endurance and body control were immediately put to the test due to a strict filming schedule. The camera tracked motion. First, the body had to adjust. Fatigue never exhibited on screen, although it was present throughout the operation. The final result was the brilliant Technicolor light, not a state of protection. American cinema stretched its narrative range toward the sea and the pirate world a few years after the war ended. In The Spanish Main, Maureen O'Hara was in the center of those conflicts. Her character has to function inside the action rhythm of the movie, speaking, moving, and reacting as part of an ongoing chain rather than existing as someone to be shielded or expected. In this case, the strong woman's image emerged as an outcome rather than a proclamation. The role itself would collapse in the absence of adequate strength. In 1947, Sinbad the Sailor premiered at a period when Technicolor had acquired a level of brilliance that practically eliminated awareness of the labor behind it. Saturated colors, powerful lighting, and beautifully designed compositions make O'Hara a significant visual focal point. However, she needed to retain endurance, control movement, and precisely manage timing in order to remain natural in crowded circumstances and relentless action rhythms. Characteristics rarely seen as part of feminine performance. It was much simpler to recognize beauty at that time than it was to produce it. When Maureen O'Hara was at the apex of her career as one of Hollywood's most famous Technicolor faces in 1949, a solitary event highlighted the actual bounds of what was deemed safety for female superstars. According to O'Hara's later in her book, Tiz describes how, during a meeting arranged on the pretense of employment, she was sexually assaulted by a powerful producer in the studio system. There were no witnesses, the incident did not take place in public, and there was no solid proof that would compel the system to react through well-known legal procedures. But it wasn't the act that was a turning moment in and of itself. It was how Hollywood handled the subsequent events. O'Hara did not remain silent. She told the administration of the studio about the occurrence. Instead of an open investigation, the media provided the first answer. The tabloids of the period focused on the moral character of the complainant rather than who had done what. Headlines questioned motives, virtue, and whether a famous actress was earning too much of it. In order to conclude the case in a way that would have protected the victim, there was neither a formal indictment nor a strong enough legal finding. Instead, the incident continued to make news as a scandal, and the woman who had raised her voice was linked to that dispute. The fallout took the form of a well-known form of silent retaliation within the studio system rather than a public collapse. Acting was not forbidden to Maureen O'Hara. Projects slowed down, but her contract was not immediately terminated. Certain key jobs quickly disappeared from consideration. Her interactions with the system's mechanism were no longer fluid. This was an intentional slowness that was sufficient to communicate a message, but not obvious enough to openly reject, rather than an expulsion. Many decades later, Maureen O'Hara's story was finally re-examined for what it was, as talks about harassment, power, and Hollywood's cultures of silence got more exact vocabulary. Not a scandal, simply a situation that happened too early, at an age when a woman telling the truth could still be twisted into a moral test imposed upon her alone. It was unnecessary to highlight Maureen O'Hara's film image by the time Against All Flags was released in the early 1950s. She wasn't hidden by her male co-stars, nor did she stand outside the action. O'Hara's character existed as a true counterforce within the film's space, moving, colliding, and sustaining the rhythm of conflict via her own physical presence without the need for narrative protection. This was happening long before Hollywood came up with the name female action hero, and before the concept itself became a profitable model. O'Hara was known as the Queen of Technicolor in those years, a convenient way to shorthand her dazzling on-screen character. Technicolor enhanced light, deepened color, and made it more difficult to disguise movement on set. Every unit of labor was so exaggerated. Errors became apparent. Fatigue was impossible to conceal, and the direct forces on the body prevented any softening. Light completed the frame, but it also decreased the amount of safety space behind it. O'Hara frequently declined employment during this time because she believed they harmed the perception of Irish women or trivialized her heritage. These decisions were not received as professional standards, but as indicators of someone who didn't know the rules of the game. Well-known labels were affixed by the press and studio circles: difficult, uncooperative, and inflexible. In the days of the studio system, O'Hara would sometimes go straight after studios over contract disputes, which was practically against the law. Instead of a public collapse, the upshot was a quiet retreat from several secure positions in return for a consistent image that didn't need the system's approval. In an era when many actresses survived via compromise, the act of saying no became a conscious sort of risk. Cinema started looking for an alternative type of compression when visual spectacle had reached a point where it could no longer be intensified. This meant that visual force alone was no longer the center of gravity for Maureen O'Hara. She continued to collaborate with John Ford on larger-scale productions in addition to Technicolor action scenes, and she started a series of movies with John Wayne. Rio Grande started on a new landscape with a more distinct narrative structure, quicker tempo, and clear commercial goals. The Ford-Wayne O'Hara team instantly became a well-known formula thanks to continuous movie office revenues. Later movies like Big Jake, McLintock, and The Wings of Eagles continue that tendency. Big productions, extended shooting schedules, and a strictly set working order. O'Hara and John Wayne's extraordinary on-screen chemistry led audiences and the media to believe that they were in a real-life romance for decades, yet no credible evidence ever materialized. O'Hara frequently conveyed their love for one another in terms of respect for one another. They were later lauded by the Hollywood press as the most compelling couple who never went too far. A rare instance of non-transgression in a system where backstage tales often exceeded what was depicted on screen, and actors' private lives were often appropriated by the films that the public adored. The Quiet Man was the clearest example of the conflict in the collaboration. The project marked O'Hara's return to her birthplace in a production with a big budget and definite economic aspirations. It was shot in Ireland as a landscape with its own memories impacting behavior and narrative rhythm rather than as a decorative backdrop. The presence of two of her brothers on set further blurred the line between her personal and professional lives. During a close-up sequence, the action did not pause at the correct moment. Maureen O'Hara's hand was broken on set. Filming did not halt. Medical assistance was provided, the incident was quickly documented, and then it was abandoned so that the production could continue. No backstage mythos was formed around the accident. When The Quiet Man initially came out, it was a box office hit, won 2 Academy Awards for Best Director and Best Color Cinematography, and quickly rose to become one of John Ford and John Wayne's most well-known movies. Because Maureen O'Hara fully embraced the beat that the piece demanded, her presence is intimately linked to the film, not because of a declaration or title. O'Hara did not steer the creative process inside that framework, but she was also not compelled to do so. Her character arrived precisely at the script's places of tension, sustaining conflict and necessity inside the narrative flow. There were no moments manufactured to signal personal difference, only a repetitive presence across manufacturing cycles where arriving in the precise place meant more than being named. Maureen O'Hara was asked to stay on the same trajectory following The Quiet Man. Strong, action-packed female characters have a history of film office success. Certain encounters are enough to affect how one views future offers even when they don't leave any evident trace on a set. As before, the proposals were completely created and presented correctly. She just didn't sign. Until the end of the afternoon, the contract was still on the desk. The movies that came after were nonetheless made and distributed under clear hierarchies of authority, with little room for deviation. No announcement of a turning point was made, just a longer workday, enough to gradually push O'Hara away from stable job and put her under a different kind of strain, not from failure, but from adhering to a system that made it impossible to move around. In the early 1960s, Maureen O'Hara returned to the screen in The Parent Trap. She was put in the shifting family structure of post-war America rather than the well-known domain of action or physical battle in the movie. In a gentler narrative rhythm, her presence was stable, anchoring, and softly leading. The movie became a big hit, watched frequently by generations, and introduced O'Hara into the early recollections of a brand new audience. That appearance did not herald a new period of her career, but confirmed something else. She has never been forgotten by the people. She was just no longer in the middle of the system. Following The Parent Trap, Maureen O'Hara's big screen performances drastically declined. She did not enter the well-known cycle of middle-aged female roles that Hollywood typically gave, nor did she attempt to remain recognizable through safe repeats. There was never any official explanation or announcement of this absence as a withdrawal. It developed gradually over many years, more like a condition that became ingrained than a choice that required explanation. Television developed a new working rhythm while cinema steadily reduced the space available for elder female characters. Maureen O'Hara frequently made appearances in TV movies, talk shows, and special programs. She was not compelled to uphold a predetermined image or bear symbolic weight there. It was possible to be present without taking center stage thanks to television. The function of a familiar voice, interlocutor, or rhythm keeper. The truth is that music predates the color frame by a very long way. O'Hara went back to her voice and the Irish cultural structures she had grown up with as the silver screen space continued to diminish. When recording folk music, she was careful not to commercialize it. The recordings were well-spoken, leisurely, and faithful to traditional form. On stage, O'Hara stood like someone long accustomed to the discipline of live performance. No editing, no concealing, no margin if the beat slipped. Audiences stayed because they believed that a cultural current was being upheld, even though they had come for the voice. Over time, television and music started to move in tandem. Although they didn't take the place of movies, they did let O'Hara continue to work in settings that didn't challenge aging the way Hollywood usually did. There was no declaration of retreat or justification for the change. Everything was justified in the same way that it has been throughout her career. O'Hara did not seek to exploit her previous celebrity to force a space open when it started to close. She moved to places where she could still work full-time. One axis was no longer central to Maureen O'Hara's artwork. The lights went off. She spread her presence over several areas. The rhythm of labor continued without a role waiting in advance, and without a position that needed previous confirmation. When Maureen O'Hara was no longer incorporated into the daily operations of production, Hollywood finally returned to chanting her name. O'Hara utilized a wheelchair to attend an awards presentation in 2014. American media typically regarded the occasion as a delayed apology, an overdue recognition. Hollywood finally apologizes. At 94, she made no attempt to alter history or deliver a long speech. Only a single sentence was uttered and quoted again in the days that followed. "This is really meaningful to me." There was no need to replicate the climax or seal emotion. It was some time before the recognition arrived. After all, the important choices had already been made. Maureen O'Hara's career was only truly named once she was no longer standing in its center. Her private life became more apparent after that quiet moment, not as an unimportant side note to her work, but rather as a parallel location that had always coexisted with it. For Maureen O'Hara, marriage did not appear as a sanctuary after stardom. It seemed like a life she could live without becoming someone she wasn't. She did not seek protection. She was looking for a way of living that could coexist with her career, where respect was not a daily must, and love did not require silent sacrifice. However, private life opens without notice of the cracks that lie within. In contrast to the movie setting, where all boundaries are established beforehand. In 1939, Maureen O'Hara was married for the first time at a pretty young age, when many problems were supposed to work themselves out. George Brown entered her life more as a formality than a romantic story. There was hardly any opportunity for the two of them to truly develop a shared existence. There were no recurrent mourns, no little patterns sustained long enough to turn into memory. The marriage quickly fell apart. It seemed to leave no wounds at all since it was so gentle. Yet precisely because of that, it left behind a gap. The idea that a marriage could fail without no apparent reason, and that leaving did not always require an explanation for what transpired with trust. As Maureen O'Hara's film career drew her into an ever more demanding work pattern in the years that followed, her body and mind were continuously pushed by non-stop shooting schedules. She approached another relationship with a caution formed by prior experience. Will Price did not arrive as an impulse. He appeared to be a personification of order. Someone who could keep private life from vanishing as everything else accelerated. During a time of hard work and ongoing stress, she remarried in 1941. There was a sensation of being taken care of at first. Over time, that concern evolved into something else. Without resistance, the money left her hands. Little judgments were replaced with brief sentences. "Let me take care of it." There was simply a sluggish, ongoing unease that became worse every day, as though the ground beneath her feet were steadily tilting. There was neither an alarm moment nor a single breaking point. Not enough to be identified, but enough to upset the balance. Silences become more commonplace as alcohol became ingrained in daily life, and authority assumed the appearance of accountability. When Maureen O'Hara became pregnant, it did not bring the tenderness people normally expect. While everything around her remained at its customary speed, her body started to alter. If anything, rougher. Fatigue could no longer be concealed under shooting schedules. Professional discipline was not an effective approach to delay discomfort. In private, however, everything went on as if nothing needed to be changed. Conflicts now exceeded what might be referred to as common disagreement. They crossed into violations sufficiently for the body to register danger before the mind could define it. Not lengthy, not loud, but sufficient for the body to recollect what consciousness had not yet fully identified. There was no outside involvement, no witnesses, and nothing maintained as indisputable evidence. Only a woman forced to learn how to remain upright within her own body, day after day, in a living circumstance that accepted no deviation and did not accept weakness even during pregnancy. Maureen O'Hara did not discuss it. She continued to work, adhered to schedules, and performed scenarios that required endurance that her body was gradually losing. Pregnancy did not become a protected state for her. It turned becoming something she had to covertly and gently protect herself from. Only when she saw that constraints, hitherto sufficient to protect herself, were no longer enough for another existence, did the notion of leaving arise, not in terror, not in tears, but in a harsh clarity. There are some things you can handle alone, even if someone else's body is entirely dependent on you. The birth of Bronwyn did not bring a miracle. It made things clearer. Motherhood did not weaken Maureen O'Hara. It made the distinction between sacrifice and endurance plain. When a child's safety was fully in her hands, what she had previously silently accepted for herself became unbearable. In 1953, the partnership collapsed. While her career was going strong, Maureen O'Hara departed as a single mother. Will Price's later death did not bring closure because he was unwilling to wait for his private life to mend. Years had passed by the time Maureen O'Hara received the news. No longer in a position to ask direct questions and no longer as a wife, she ultimately admitted to harboring suspicions, but she refrained from making complaints. There was no resolution, no release point. That gray gap persisted in memory like a heavy mass, not deconstructed, not wiped, but set aside, since life at that time did not allow her to pause and look back again. The years that followed passed without marking a new beginning in Maureen O'Hara's emotional life. Her days were completely consumed by work, kids, and trying to prevent life from deviating from its usual course. Love moved away from the center, but did not vanish. It is no longer a place to stake feelings or something to fully trust. No decision was made to turn it off, and no search was done to find a replacement. Only time moving slowly enough for change to happen without ever having to be recognized. Charles Blair came into her life at a different moment, and Maureen O'Hara no longer approached love with a need to be saved after experiencing the most traumatic times in her own life. Blair was not a part of the movie industry. He was not forced into the spotlight, nor was he impacted by filming schedules or public opinion. He comes from the aviation industry, where there is no such thing as a function, and every action has instantaneous consequences. He measured risk not by emotion, but by mechanics, weather, and accountability. Their relationship developed slowly, without the shape of compensation. Blair was not Maureen O'Hara's haven, and she was not a symbol for him. They were connected by something both new and familiar, the capacity to coexist in both life and work without each having to compromise. When the decision to commit was decided, there was a drive toward reality rather than loud romance. Maureen O'Hara was drawn away from Hollywood by shared life, not as a retreat, but as a decision. She started a beat that had nothing to do with filming in the Virgin Islands. Antilles airboats did not function on fame. It survived on deadlines, legal structures, funding, and decisions that had to be made at the correct moment. There, Maureen O'Hara was not recognized first as a star. She was present as someone who shared responsibility, where every deviation had a cost. Love was no longer the main emotional center there. It coexisted with duties, employment, and everyday existence. It doesn't have to prove itself. There's no reason to conceal, no need for silent sacrifice to maintain an image. This was a special moment for Maureen O'Hara, when protecting one's private life wasn't always required. Not because risk had vanished, but because she no longer entered it with the naivety of her early years. That existence was tragically disrupted by the plane accident in 1978. There was a startling void within love, throughout family, and across the entire functional framework that the two had borne together. No preparation, no farewells. Maureen O'Hara was unable to retreat due to this time disadvantage. She remained, took charge of the business, and encountered not only financial and legal difficulties, but also mistrust directed at a woman who had never been ready for such a role. Maureen O'Hara kept leading the airline for a length of time, not as a symbol of resilience, but as someone who refused to allow another edifice collapse. The rhythm of operations was maintained. Decisions were made when needed. There was grief, but it did not take precedence over accountability. Family was no longer a safe refuge for feelings, but a place where every choice had actual consequences. Marriage and family life took away O'Hara's sense of security, even though movies provided her fame and reputation. There was no editing to correct mistakes, no part to hide behind, and no light to conceal exhaustion. Just a woman standing in the real world, moving on because she could no longer conceal herself rather than because she had overcome suffering. In her latter years, she briefly lived in Ireland before coming back to the U.S. and eventually settling with her family in Idaho. She left the center based on the same logic that had guided her career: complete the tasks at hand and go. At a period when many icons are compelled to reflect in public, O'Hara chose a calm rhythm, one in which living no longer required image confirmation. Her health worsened in the natural course of age. The speed decreased. Extended travel times were reduced. The frequency of public appearances decreased and ultimately ceased. Not because of a specific diagnosis, but because her body no longer needed to answer to anyone else's pace. Time was split up into small, boring tasks: reading, listening to music, interacting with loved ones, witnessing days pass without the need to note them. Family became the practical center of this life through constant presence rather than raucous festivities. O'Hara was a self-disciplined old woman who kept her own pace, didn't make demands, and didn't create gaps through titles. The media was not avoided, but neither was it invited. Absence unfolded naturally, as though the decision had long been determined. On October 24, 2015, Maureen O'Hara, 95, passed away in her sleep in Boise, Idaho, the direct delivering of the news putting an end to a life that had long since ceased to captivate public attention. She was buried close to her husband, Charles Blair, in Arlington National Cemetery. A decision based more on family life than on cinematic tradition. Over the span of more than 60 years of employment, O'Hara made appearances in more than 60 films, not as a succession of peaks, but rather as successive cycles of work. Strength was not explained by her places. Her characters weren't developed as outliers. They didn't require a romantic arc to establish centrality, nor did they need trauma to explain toughness. As part of the internal logic of the tale, they stood inside the frame. Remove them, and the structure would lose balance. This translated into real technical difficulties on set, enduring challenging filming conditions, keeping rhythm during action, and working without emotional downtime to recover. These demands were presented as usual working conditions rather than as special obstacles experienced by women, and what mattered was that ordinariness. When Hollywood started making less room for older female characters, O'Hara's standing remained intact. She might become less well-known without jeopardizing her professional standing, because what she left behind was an operational standard rather than an image that required upkeep. When women are shown and treated as members of the system rather than as anomalies in need of protection, they may endure for a long time in the film industry. The honorary Oscar arrived relatively late in 2014. Neither did it close a tale or reopen a chapter. It just confirmed what has been known for a long time. Some occupations only become entirely apparent if they no longer require light to sustain them. O'Hara never followed the rules of entertainment journalism during her career. She didn't create a tragic persona, take advantage of gossip, or sell her personal life to keep people interested. Her silence was a tool of control rather than avoidance. The media was both interested and disarmed by this, There was no story to exploit, no resistance to overcome. The decision to consistently defy press regulations helped O'Hara's reputation endure news cycles that rely on ongoing publicity. What remains is not a blueprint to be copied, but a ground that has been firmly compacted. Based on this premise, women can be harsh, flawed, and despised by society's expectations without being viewed as an issue that needs to be fixed. Future generations tread on it without knowing who leveled it. They only understand that standing there makes work possible. Despite being sidelined, Maureen O'Hara did not leave the film industry. Nor did she stay on to defend an image that had completed its historical duty. She moved away at the right time, using the same logic that had guided her entire life and career. There is no reason to stay only to maintain presence when a building no longer requires you to operate. Maureen O'Hara's place in movie history is made clear in that quiet, when no identifying information is needed. Not as a symbol to be revered, but as a rule that has been placed in place to ensure that movies can continue on without being excluded. Hurry up! Whoa!